Welcome, everybody, to Earth Central. I'm your host, Alex Wowra, and today I have the pleasure of talking to Karl Burkart. Karl is the Deputy Director of One Earth. He is a frequent contributor discussing global sustainability matters on outlets such as Medium.com and TED Talks, and he first crossed my path when he was the Director of Innovation, Media, and Technology at the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. Karl, welcome to Earth Central.
Yeah,
Um,
great to be here. Thanks for having
yeah,
me.
and we can start off by I'm curious a little bit how your journey has come from working at Leonardo DiCaprio to co-founding One Earth, and fill me in a little bit on who you are and what you've been up to.
Yeah, well, man, it's been a while since we've talked, and you seem to look just as young as ever, but I feel like I've aged a lot. Yeah, so we were right in the middle of the Leonardo DiCaprio sort of this 10-year period, roughly 2009, 2019, and I was involved right in the very beginning, helping the executive director develop a lot of strategy around grant making and raised a ton of money, like 120 million, and basically the idea was to spend it all, and that pretty much wrapped in 2019, and then One Earth. So I had incubated One Earth, and it was probably a little after you and I first met.
Mhm.
We weren't doing much in conservation and science and technology. It was very much like conservation type grants and sustainable livelihoods and indigenous rights. And we were doing a lot of that. All the grant making was really centered on that kind of work. And but then, we realized there were huge gaps in science to help decision makers. And that's in particular funders. That's how we started. It's like, we need a science program to basically just decide how to allocate all this money. And then we saw lots of other decision makers needed the same kind of science. So like we had at the time, like net zero had just been created. I was actually involved peripherally in launching net zero in the UK with a website called Track Zero. So it was introducing the concept of net zero that then made it into the Paris Agreement. And then it's sort of like, well, what does that mean? What is that going to look like? Like at the time, there were no models
Mhm.
that really showed how you'd even remotely achieve this idea, which we can explain. People are still very confused about what net zero
Yeah.
means. We can explain that later, but that's kind of how One Earth started, because we were like, okay, this net zero thing is off. Leonardo had become a UN messenger piece for climate, which was my background, even though most of the foundation work had been on conservation and biodiversity and things like that. So we really realized we needed this new platform to talk about nature and climate together. And both of those had huge deficiencies in the science.
Mhm.
And so One Earth kind of got named because we commissioned a climate model, which is now called the One Earth Climate Model. And that was the first attempt to model all aspects of the global transition for society to net zero by 2050, by mid-century, let's say. And so how do you meet that energy demand? What type of energy demand is it? Where? How does it differ based on regions? So no one no one had ever done it, and I kind of couldn't believe it. I just remember the day we were like, "Oh, okay, I guess we're like funding a climate model." And so that's sort of how One Earth kind of got kickstarted as sort of a project inside of the DiCaprio Foundation. And then we also did a couple of pretty significant grants in science and technology. One of those was Global Fishing Watch,
Mhm.
which was really cool. That's how I kind of got my feet wet in the AI world. It was one of the first applications of developing a neural net, so that people could understand the movement of ships in the deep ocean. And the cool thing about it is the ships themselves have these transponders. They have to constantly communicate where they are, but no one was aggregating that. So this application was built with a whole consortium, and we provided a lot of the funding for that to make that big bet on, this new technology will be a way to really make a difference in terms of illegal fishing. That's what we started out. Then there were some really interesting papers that came out of that project, including the realization they were able to locate human trafficking nodes by using the illegal fishing routes. And so like there was all this interesting stuff that got unlocked because of that investment. So that for me was a huge wake up in the power of science to make change, because, you know, like you could do hundreds of millions in grants to local communities for fishing, or you could like do this one grant and change the entire dynamic around fishing in the high seas with, you know, one small thing. So both are really important, but One Earth was really then starting to look at that science approach. Yeah. So then and then it quickly morphed into lots of other projects in science world, mostly science. It was called Innovation, Science, and Technology, I think. Yeah, because we were trying to bundle a lot of things together. Yeah, now to date, so all that work we've done now 40 peer-reviewed or technical papers in a variety of topics covering One Earth, different categories. And yeah, and then in 2019, the foundation closed and One Earth sprung out. And so we became independent NGO doing a lot of this. Really now, almost for me, it's 99% just working on all the science. Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, it's cool that you mentioned Global Fishing Watch. So our paths somehow, in a very, very indirect way, actually crossed there, because there was in previous work, I have actually promoted Global Fishing Watch because I used to work with one of the partners that was working with them, and I've seen that they've been in the news. I think recently too. There's been, I don't remember exactly what it was about, but there was quite some positive press with it seems to be like a very effective platform that it's become.
Incredible. Yeah. You know, and that for us, that was the biggest grant we've still ever done. The biggest science grant was like 6 million, I think, was the grant we did. But like no one else was, there were other funders coming in at like 1 million here and 1 million there, but like, you know, we just went for it because we realized like how important and how behind like all of the work on the oceans was. So yeah, it's kind of funny. I just forgot because I've been so involved in the climate modeling and the nature landscape modeling work, like the map behind me, that I forgot that's kind of like one of our first big grants we did. And it really, these things just have, that's the amazing thing about science is like, you know, I wish there were more funders that got it, because it's like you don't know that if you fund one science paper, it's going to lead to anything. You know, it might just contribute this little piece, and then that's going to contribute to another paper, and that'll contribute to another paper, and suddenly it's like it builds this whole body of knowledge. And then other times you do one little paper and it becomes like this huge epic thing. Like one of our papers we had last year, we published last year, which is like, sometimes you think this is the paper that's going to change the world, and it's like, no one cares. And then, you know, and then you do this other paper that's just like, yeah, our paper last year was ranked as like one of the top, I think it was in the top 10 papers across all like academic publications.
That's
So it's like,
amazing.
you kind of just never know. But the thing is that science has a long tail. You never know. Someone might pick that up later and build an AI model off of it, and then suddenly it unlocks a whole other thing. So that's why I love science funding, and I feel like my constant job is trying to figure out how to explain to funders how important it is. And we've had some success at that, especially with AI coming online now, and a lot of the interest in using these new technologies. So yeah, we're kind of still on the cusp of it.
Yeah, it seems like anything related to geospatial science and AI and these kind of there, it seems like the spring is coming. Kind of the understanding, I think, everywhere is just expanding so rapidly. What these solutions can offer. This is also sort of the space we're working in, right? We use geospatial solutions for sustainability purposes, and it's also where I've been working in communications for a long time, but the majority of my more recent positions were all in one way or another promoting geospatial data machine learning and sustainability in one conjunction or another. And I think you can see there is a market in the private space, in the nonprofit space. It really, in the public space, there seems to be really that's like, if people want to look into places where I think a lot is happening, this is one of the areas.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, and you're right. We're at the spring. I think that there's as you know very well, there's a big difference between data and information.
Hmm.
And then I would say then there's a difference between information and like insight. And I think we have a lot of carts before horses right now, if you know this phrase, American phrase, that we have the tools have advanced. We have a plethora of data, but there's enormous problems in indexing and collating that data. And AI sometimes makes it worse by over interpreting similarities or dissimilarities. So I still think so our work is, we have sort of like we have like four tiers really, but there's data production, like, which is, I would say, the raw data. Then there's modeling, which takes that data and makes an piece of information out of it.
Hmm.
And then the level up from that is the frameworks. So
Hmm.
frameworks are kind of like, okay, we have that information. What does that mean
Yeah.
for achieving net zero or for achieving nature positive in this sector? And then above that, we have a layer of tools. So we have a couple tools that we've built that help, especially financial decision makers, to make decisions. So that's kind of like the stack that One Earth works on. But I'm still often spending my time down in the mud, if you will, because we still have a huge, huge deficiency of data, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's probably also good to keep a leg in the mud, right? Like it's always good to understand, I think, all
Well,
the
it
facts.
keeps you humble.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anytime anyone comes up and says, I've got it all figured out with this new tool, you're like, no, you don't.
Yeah.
No, you don't, because I know all the data sources you're looking at.
Mhm.
Unless you're Harry Potter and you have magic.
So, with One Earth, right? I get the impression. So I guess you're referring to it as a climate model, but I guess you could sort of say a climate and biodiversity model, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
well, it's the two are coming together more and more, I'd say, every day, and that's just in the whole world. But yeah, we were really early in that, like,
Hmm.
because we had to, because we were basically a conservation foundation that suddenly became a climate organization sort of overnight. And so our first question was like, well, what do tigers and lemurs and pandas have to do with climate? Right. And I sometimes I still start my talk that way, because I'm like, what do tigers and tapirs and pellet and
Yeah.
toucans have to do with climate? And as it turns out, a lot.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
was really at the time like nothing. I mean, absolutely nothing. Not even like I said, there wasn't even an energy transition climate model that was any good. And we had been doing work in that space for like a while now. It's my background in energy, renewable energy. But we were like an early funder in Drawdown, Project Drawdown. We were an early funder in Natural Climate Solutions. That was a project out of TNC that the Doris Duke Foundation supported. We joined that. So we funded some of the first papers on, we call it animating the carbon cycle. So that's like the carbon cycle, maybe explain this later if people are interested, but like how the earth actually absorbs and releases carbon dioxide, that's all contingent upon complex interactions between animals and plants.
Hmm.
And that's, we barely know. And I mean, we're starting to get models on this now, like what one tiger does or what one elephant does in the carbon landscape. But yeah, at the time it was completely disconnected.
Hmm.
um, and so what we did for the second big project, so the One Earth climate model was the first. Now, in the One Earth climate model, we did have the first ever carbon removal model for using only nature-based solutions. So some of that work we funded with Natural Climate Solutions. We commissioned a series of papers to understand the role of restoration, reforestation, um, and we knew that you just can't do the 1.5C goal of the Paris Agreement without removing carbon, legacy carbon, in addition to rapidly transitioning energy. And it's so crazy because at the time we were criticized, like, oh, you can't talk about nature, that's not serious. Like the energy stuff is
Wow.
serious. Nature
Wow.
doesn't matter. You're like, yeah, the nature matters too. So yeah,
Wow.
our model, we had the very first Monte Carlo analysis of how rapidly we could remove carbon using um, restoration degraded land. So that was in the model. It wasn't biodiversity though. It was just trees. It was like, how many trees can we plant where? And then all that was added up and it was created a time series. But then the second big project was really focused on our second big question, which is, well, what do we need to protect in terms of nature for biodiversity and climate?
Mm-hmm.
So that led to the global safety net. And that's actually probably what we're now most famous for, which is interesting because it was another one of those conversations where like, okay, I guess we're also going to do a giant land cover model. And it was, that paper was really influential. I mean, we were just lucky because everyone would pick up my phone call, of course, because
Amazing.
no one cares about Karl, but everyone like see Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, everyone will pick up the phone. So yeah, we got this great coalition of scientists together and we published a really important paper called Global Deal for Nature. And that was basically, there's a parallel conference. So the UN has the climate conference, which is the most famous. Then there's a parallel conference called the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity.
Mm-hmm.
Both of those conferences were incepted at the same time at the Rio Convention, but they're two separate conferences. There's actually a third conference, which is the CCD, which is
Mm-hmm.
on degradation. But that's hopefully that one will start coming up more. But at the time, like no one cared at all about the Biodiversity Convention, but we knew a lot of people there's going to be a big push for this now. And so we're like, well, what's the target? We have 1.5C in Paris, but what's the target for nature? No one had a target. And so we got all these people together. And around that time, there had been sort of discussions about we need to protect half of the earth, or we need to protect a third of the earth. And so all these sort of, I would call them ecumenical debates, quasi-religious debates were happening around this. And we're like, well, we need a paper on this. Like we need scientists. So we came up with this cool model, which is basically to kind of classify land in sort of 5 major ecological categories, if you will. Can talk about it later if you want, but we added it all up and it turned out that we needed about 30%
Mm-hmm.
for designated biodiversity areas, plus another 20 for ecosystem services. So that was the paper, and it was called the Global Deal for Nature. So that kind of formally introduced 30 by 30 into the peer-reviewed literature, although many people have been talking about it.
Yeah.
And then after that, there was like 1,000 papers written, and a lot of them cited that paper. Like we have I think it's now over 1,000 citations on
Mm-hmm.
that paper,
Wow.
which is just still only a few years old. That was like 2019.
Yeah.
And then in 2020, we did the global safety net, which was the geospatial model to go along with the paper from the
Mm-hmm.
year before. And that came out, as One Earth also became independent.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's again, most everything we do is scientific consortiums. So like me and others will pull together a crew of scientists to do the work. And the global safety net also had a lot of influence, and we built an app for that because we
Mm-hmm.
wanted normal people, like everyone, to access and see the data, rather than having to download it and write a Python script or whatever. Build a Google Earth app. We wanted to make it simpler, so we built our own web application on Google. We use Google Earth to do that. And subsequently we've evolved that tool. But yeah, that was sort of, if you will, kind of our big stake in biodiversity. But there's just so much more in that space too that's happening.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things you touched upon that I will get back to. one of the things though that you're saying right now, like what I think is kind of crucial to understand this, and I'm assuming this is also what what you just said also refers to one of the things that One Earth is sort of claiming on the website. What is one of the goals is to empower everyone everywhere with the knowledge and the opportunity to tackle environmental challenges, right? So I know there's a big open source, open data movement in the sustainability space, and that's my understanding now that that is essentially also where One Earth is playing a big role. From what I understand now, which kind of studies we are actually thankfully have, thanks to you guys, essentially. A lot of the work I was lucky to share in over the last few years in different positions. Kind of revolved around that concept.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, can you talk a little bit about sort of this, this how it's we understand there's a lot of there's been a lot of studies, and there's a lot of there's one of the big challenges is the depth of data, etc., but also like a little bit about the actionable side of that, right? Because as
Yeah.
you're saying, it empowers people everywhere. Yeah, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, in a variety of ways. Well, yeah, I know our mission statement is kind of crazy because it's like everywhere, all at once, or whatever that movie is. But yeah, I mean, how do you turn science into action? Like that's kind of been my mantra, or it's my question, my central question of everything we do. Like, is this paper going to be actionable in some way? So we, originally our main, you know, our main constituents were philanthropists, right?
Hmm.
Like we worked for philanthropists, we helped other philanthropists. So that kind of initially is how One Earth started. But then very quickly we realized there's all these other types of people, decision makers, very quickly expanded into the investor community. We had so many inbound requests from people putting together impact funds, or it's like a lot. There's a lot to unpack in the
Yeah.
financial sector, where we were producing things that were actually very valuable for the financial sector. That's an area we've leaned into a lot. Businesses coming to us, most of these were like inbound. We're like, oh, we don't have a program to deal with businesses. So it's one of the things we're still trying to work on. But so you kind of had those three as sort of, and then the that we still have like governments and NGOs is a big category because we were working the UN convention. So we're trying to like be, I guess we were probably accused of being a little too activist-y in the biodiversity convention. We were pushing very hard
Hmm.
on a larger area target and inclusion of indigenous people's lands, both of which were pretty controversial. So in that convention we were we were pushing really hard, and we did that with a bunch of NGOs. So I think that's like another bucket is NGO and government, and that could be multilateral or one by one government. So like right now there's a lot of governments setting their biodiversity targets in as part of the biodiversity convention, and we're in discussions with people that are helping, sort of we're helping the helpers, we're helping the people who are tasked with developing plans for countries. Like do you protect this area over this area? Like if you only have this much, how do you prioritize that, all that kind of stuff. And then the last category is just everyday, all of us, like regular people, citizen scientists, volunteerism, kids, like and that's the stuff we really love and wish we could spend like all our time on.
Yeah.
We have to help all the investors and everything move all the trillions of dollars. So that's lately been the stakeholder, and there's some really fascinating discoveries we've made about the financial sector and like the kind of data they need, and how those decisions are made, and
Hmm.
how you move money in the trillions. That's like a big question we all have to ask. So yeah, those are kind of like the top categories. And yeah, I mean, it's all actionable. And it has permutations, that can ripple out if you don't get it right. So
Hmm.
I think that's like what keeps me up at night is there's a huge acceleration now, especially in nature. Like we had a huge push in climate from 2015 to now, I'd say.
Mhm.
So think of 2015, 2025, and now it's like really the nature
Mhm.
push, nature positive push is ramping up, and the data deficits there are really severe. Um,
Yeah.
and there's reasons for that. Like the climate convention has a scientific body. It's officially part of the process. That's called the IPCC, and they are funded to release reports and build consensus and models. And the nature side, we don't have, there's nothing like that.
Right.
There is something, it's called IPBES, and it's actually, they're doing an amazing job with very little money. They're not like permanently funded at the scale they need to be, and they're very much more politically, they have to be more politically neutral. So it's less science driven and a bit more, but they do a lot. So IPBES has just put out a series of great reports that are showing progress, how we're going to measure certain themes that are in the convention and progress towards those. But the reality is, like, my is a joke, but it's not a joke. We actually know much more about the physics of the upper atmosphere than we do about the land that we walk on.
Wow.
And there's over 100 geophysical climate models, like, that are figuring out how gases interact with glaciers and melting in oceans, and and then on top of that, there's 21 intermodal comparison projects that are all funded very well. And those take the models and build meta models.
Hmm.
And then in the IPCC reports, that all gets synthesized into something called CMIP6. And those comes out as the AR6, AR7. The next one will be AR7, which is the assessment report. So there's this whole humongously well-funded machine to produce the science for the decision makers around climate, but that doesn't exist.
Hmm.
So I just completed last month an inventory of like 15 of the leading land cover maps. And those are the maps that, like, is this a forest? Is this not a forest? And not a single one worked everywhere.
Hmm.
So the problem is that means right now, lots of people, companies, governments, NGOs are making decisions based on poor land cover maps. And so that's just an example of, like, this data deficiency, is that, like, then decisions and targets are going to be set, and and there's nothing like that kind of interplay. So that's one of my things this year I'm really focused on. Like, what is it going to take to actually get a good land cover map, which is something I didn't think I had to deal with, honestly. I thought that would have been covered by now with all the big
Interesting.
NGOs and all their billions of dollars that they have. We still don't have this map. A problem is, in a lot of the land cover maps, they say that this thing here is a forest. In fact, it's a palm plantation
Right.
or a coconut plantation, but the model doesn't have the fidelity to distinguish that. So then a company now in the EU, you're going to have to report and disclose on this. So now a company has to say, yeah, my supply chain is in this area, which is forested. Okay, so then the next year you decide to get rid of the palm and put coconut or something else. And that's called a deforestation event,
Hmm.
because according to the map, that was a forest. No, it wasn't a forest.
Right.
And so that gets cut down, and then the company gets penalized. So you can see the sort of problems we're about to have.
Yep.
And this is why we got to get the data right. Yeah.
I have. This is kind of there's a lot of points on this actually that I want to respond to, because first and foremost, what I should say, since we're hosting the podcast. So this is actually one of the things that I've also talked to with our product team and our that they have explained to me, and the Earth observation engineers, that this is a big challenge, right? This identifying the right kind of forest cover, and one of the things that we're trying to do, this one I know for sure, is that in some of our platforms, to do an assessment, if a site that an investor, if they want to invest in a ARR project, for example, then they we are trying to go beyond the methodology that exists, so that and a similar issue is the historical assessment good enough, right? So not only what type, but also how long and how exactly has it looked. So in order for it to have a net positive benefit, it needs to actually add a forest cover, of course. And one of the things we're doing is we're actually adding 10 years beforehand to the usual methodology to make sure that we can make have more scrutiny, essentially, when we assess when people want to invest in a project to see if it's actually worthwhile. And then there's, of course, also the assessment. You invest in a certain project that covers a certain area, and you also look at the surrounding areas. That's also what we're doing, so that you can see, is this just a drop on the hot stone, essentially, or is this really worthwhile? So this is one of the things. We're very familiar with this
Yeah,
issue.
you guys know all. I mean, it's so great you're working on it, and you're probably ahead of the curve. Like, I think the thing I worry about a little bit, I think next year everyone's gonna be like, oh, we should all be in geospatial data, and then you're gonna get all these oddballs coming in thinking they're gonna build a language model or something like. But yeah, I mean, you guys are on the cutting edge, and that's I didn't know that about the back series, because that's like actually one of the things. One of the asset managers we talked to, they're really interested in time series, because they wanna show trends. They use trends in their long-term forecasts, and so that you need to know the part before in order to predict the section after. But yeah, you've got both resolution, cadence, and classification is the other one. But yeah, you at some point, by the way, we should do a deep dive with you, because I would love to look at some of your maps. I haven't. I've only looked in terms of the private sector. Almost everything I've been looking at is in the open source, for the most part.
Yeah.
I looked at 3 private sector offerings, and I'd love to see, because you guys have like 600 million hectares, I think, now under observation, something like that.
To say it confidently, I'd have to ask the technical
Yeah,
team to not say the wrong thing, but the number seems familiar.
yeah, I think that,
Yeah,
yeah, that's great. I mean, my thing is, I wish I had bigger budgets, because then I could just sort of buy all the data.
yeah,
Um, but
yeah,
sometimes the science, like not having the money, is actually maybe a good thing, because it forces you to
yeah,
innovate and work with scientists. So
yeah. Yeah, I mean, my take on it is that it all, like, there are both sides, right? I've been on both sides of it, and I think there's a need for both, essentially.
mhm.
And I get, what I can say is that when I see this, like, even that everybody covers a different niche, like you mentioned intelligence, then there's us, then I used to work at visuality. Everybody has sort
Yeah.
of their own, and I this the open source movement, I think, is super important in this, because I used to do a lot of stories that revolved around Global Forest Watch, for example.
Mhm.
And what you were saying earlier, an interesting thing is I once wrote an article about how actually um, an open source platform like Global Forest Watch, they even have like conflict alerts kind of and things like that. You can actually deduct even more than just environmental stories when you look at the history of deforestation. And so, like, we found out when we were playing with the data that I was like, okay, there's all these conflicts happening around the world. Let's look into what the data tells us. And we found out that for instance, we could see that there was some activity, some specific kind of rebel or something like that, military activity happening in Syria. I think it was from some Turkish forces or something, because
Mhm.
there's this odd deforestation. We're wondering, what is this
Wow.
deforestation? And it was because they were burning. I then I looked at the time frame, then I looked Google News and these kind of things, and eventually found out, yeah, those were probably the people that were purposefully burning down plantations,
Mhm.
right? And so you see these kind of things. Also now with the war in Ukraine, you can see from where the forest cover goes, of course. Also, that's also where a lot of military activity is, and these kind of things. So the hope, I guess, at least, is that if these things hopefully turn better in the future, that these tools can also help us to regrow forest, for example, and do other sustainability measures faster, without as much on-ground inspection as you would traditionally need. Yeah, but I wanted to get into net zero a little bit, because that's one of the big things, and then we can also talk about the role of technology later, and nature positive, and 30 by 30 a little bit more. But on net zero, I just wanted to sort of, just also for the audience, so that a lot of different people watch this, and so that we get that they don't get lost. So just to put simply, and you can complement my explanation and correct it if you like, but put simply, net zero essentially means cutting carbon emissions to a smaller amount of residual emissions that can be absorbed and durably stored by nature, and by other carbon dioxide removal measures, so that they essentially leave zero in the atmosphere. And the UN has once called net zero one of the greatest challenges of humankind. Yeah, I guess I'll take your take on it first before into give more.
Well, I mean, the way I describe, I wish, the best way to explain net zero is that it means almost zero.
Right.
So that means we are almost emitting zero emissions, and whatever that little bit is that we're not, we haven't mitigated through switching to solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, whatever you want, that's carbon-free energy, because almost all of this is coming from burning of fossil fuels. That little extra bit you have to remove, and that's in the convention. It's the parties of the convention, which are the governments, the 196 governments. Of course, the U.S. is pulling out, and but then also it trickles down into companies wanting to set net zero targets, because everyone sort of is setting it kind of created this mass movement to like set your trajectory to get to zero or nearly zero by 2050. Now, if you're a tech company, you can get to zero. If you're a concrete company, you can't get to zero.
Right.
If you're an aviation company, you actually can get pretty close to zero. But it requires electric fuels, and that's a big part of our climate model, how to do that. Steel, every sector kind of has a different trajectory. So the thing that was so confused, so botched, as a comms guy, I think as well, like me, you probably agree that the entire rollout of this was horrifically botched many times over. Despite really good people trying to explain it, no one ever explained it as simply as almost zero, and then carbon, and also contextualizing the difference between carbon neutral and net zero. I find that was actually the biggest thing that climate funders, and I was actually I was trying to raise money for this because I felt like the comms was not going well. And then, we had our John Oliver moment, where it pulled the rug out from everyone about, because we hadn't addressed those issues. And no one really understood the role of carbon credits, for example, and how that could help a company get that little extra part and not do it through greenwashing. So I think, unfortunately, there was a lot of botched comms around it, and now there's all this politics in it, and ESG is sort of a 4-letter word in the U.S. And Bezos pulled out his funding from SBTI, which was the body governing sort of net zero targets. Yeah, so we had kind of a problem. Really, in the end, it really is technically feasible, not that expensive. There's this residual part that's going to be really hard, and we can compensate for that through removals. But by the way, we need to do tons of removals anyway if you want. Net zero doesn't equate to 1.5C. So,
Yeah.
I mean, if you did net zero only, by 2050, we'd still probably be at 1.7, 1.8, because you have to also remove a lot of legacy carbon in order to get down to 1.5C. Again,
Right.
something everyone is still super confused about. But yeah, I think our model is very clear. We actually advocate for net zero by 2040,
Mhm.
but we have a bigger buffer for how much removal needs to happen, and all very technically feasible, not terribly expensive, and people have greatly overcomplicated it. But yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's why you
Yeah,
need good comms people.
yeah, it's really I agree. I think part of the struggles with more effective climate measures is a communications issue. I agree on many levels actually. It's a I think the messaging it goes from a lot of different places, and I also understand the challenge, of course, when I work in companies or organizations that are trying to accomplish exactly that. I see the challenges too, where they come from in messaging. But I
Yeah.
think one of the examples that I'm confronted with now a lot is I think that also had to do with communication in one way, is that the idea of the carbon credits, right, and the concept of it. There was basically it led to sort of a big loss in trust because for good reasons,
Yeah.
because there were because the essentially the tech integrity of a lot of the carbon credits was questionable at best. And so this is again the space, and that's why I want to talk to you a little bit about it, right? What we are discovering now, and what we're seeing with people that we're working with, and people that we also have in our webinars that work on these methodologies. They're trying to so those are the rating agencies,
Mm.
etc. Right, for carbon projects, for example, like Vera, for instance. They're refining the methodologies, for example, and you also see that when you observe what we're seeing in the market is that there is this high demand for high integrity
Yeah.
credits. So in simple terms, carbon credits that actually work.
Yeah.
And this is what we're seeing. But of course, still, the result is that there's a lot more skepticism about this,
Yeah.
simply because of the way it has been botched before.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear a little bit from you about this.
For people interested in the kind of the background, I would suggest I wrote this piece called "Showdown at the Nature Zone," which is easy to Google because it's easy to remember. And I document this moment that happened at the COP in Glasgow, which was sort of the zenith of the 1.0, the 1.0 version of
Mhm.
carbon credits. And it was this big activist intervention, and Greta was screaming, and Jennifer Morgan, who was a big influencer, was ex- challenging the whole idea of it, and a lot of concepts related to carbon credits. Is particularly in the red category. As there's two categories in nature. I mean, I broadly think there's three categories. So there's the avoiding deforestation category, there's the new regeneration, reforestation category, and then there's sort of like an engineered category,
Mhm.
if you will. And then there's also like renewable energy credits and things like that, which most people don't think should count at this point. But yeah, I think particularly around red and sort of avoiding deforestation, you have to introduce all these sort of philosophical constructs, like avoided, like additionality, like how can we say with confidence that this would have been cut down
Mhm.
without our intervention? How much can I take credit for of that? And then leakage is another one. So like, okay, well, I protect this area, so that didn't get cut down, so they just moved to the next one over. And there's all, so I document kind of all these conceptual problems with what I would say is sort of the carbon market
Mhm.
1.0.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and then then there's the 2.0 stuff now, and partially with so I would say it's botched comms on the NGO side, You also had nonprofits running the carbon market effectively,
Mm-hmm.
which nonprofits can hardly run anything. So like they shouldn't be running a market, right? Like you need capitalists to run that. And there's actually a whole group now working on turning the carbon market into a capital market, which
Mm-hmm.
is I don't know if you know about it's the GCLU, and I think Bloomberg is funding that, which is like how do we actually make a carbon market like a commodity market?
Mm-hmm.
So there's people working on kind of the capitalism side that didn't exist previously. Then we also had botched journalism, really. But yeah, so the Guardian, did a hit job, and it was sort of NGO driven. They had very valid points, but it kind of was definitely they threw the baby out with the bathwater, as did John Oliver, who then cited that Guardian article and that study and in his. And I remember I tweeted the next day, I was like, carbon markets are done. And everyone was like, you're crazy. Because at that point, it was at the top. Like carbon markets were like $20 a ton at 25 in the spot market. Now they're down to what, like 10 cents or something.
Yeah.
I mean, so yeah, it's like they've stayed down in the
Mm-hmm.
spot market because there's like a lot of junk still left over. So yeah, we have to clear out the junk. The third piece though is what you guys are doing, which is that the technology was just not there.
Mm-hmm.
It, even the conceptual, what I put in the category of frameworks, I said we work in like data models, frameworks. Even at the framework level, they still hadn't figured out a lot of stuff. Then they didn't have the data
Mm-hmm.
because like no one, like we're still having trouble. But what EUDR I think they want sub 5 meter.
Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like, how easy it is to get your hands on a cloud-free sub 3 to 5 meter image of your project at like, regular intervals so you can estimate accurately the biomass there. And then I would go down to the data, sorry, the model level. So we have our data, like, can we even just see what are we looking at?
Mm-hmm.
And I think just now, like company like yours, Space Intelligence, Satelligence, a few others are really like trying to crack. Um, Canop is another one I really like. You probably know those guys. Like, there's this kind of crew of like young, cool tech, geospatial people working on this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Another part is like how prone is it to fire? But like the models, so then we have, okay, is it what's there? Then like how much biomass is in it?
Mm-hmm.
And like a huge paper just came out showing we're massively underestimating biomass in a lot of regions because the models just hadn't been done at scale and analyzed properly, again because we had a lot of NGOs working on this. And so, now in just, I think, was it just a week ago, Open Forest launched, which is the giant open source, open access catalog of forest data. So that happened last week.
Yeah.
We're like 2025, and like we just now got a giant open source catalog of forest data to train up.
Yeah.
So, I
And
mean,
we have
that's going to benefit companies like yours. You can now go in and like do cool things with that data. I know a lot of the data is probably old and problematic, but I'm saying, like, so then, like, how do we interpret the RGB signal or reflectance that we're seeing into biomass? And then there's the model, the framework stuff, which is like, what kind of credit can we issue off of that? So you have issues at all three levels that need to be solved. And I think like everyone, depends on the day of the week, but I feel like in general, after the past climate week, I normally spread myself really, and if you know the climate week in New York, right? There's one in London, but the one in New York is like, it's
yeah.
basically like the UN convention for this stuff. And I was really tracking all the carbon. I was going to a lot of carbon events because I wanted to see, what people are thinking about this, because in my opinion, it's essential. I mean, if we can value a removed ton of carbon properly, and that means not perfectly, because perfect is the enemy of the good. You can have, if you know the imperfection, like roughly I'm 91% sure this is correct. I can buy insurance for the other 9%.
Mm-hmm.
And there's companies now that do buffer as a service, which is essentially allowing you to buy a buffer to pad onto your carbon credit so that if something goes wrong, you basically have insurance
Yeah.
to so that you're not greenwashing. So if your trees get cut down and you bought credits there, then
Yeah.
you're getting the carbon from somewhere else. So like we're getting all these financial products now. So that's a big innovation. I think we have technology innovation like what you guys are working on. And then I think we have this evolution of the framework. I think that the standards are going to improve and become more as they gets into EU compliance. I think it's going to get more clear,
Mm-hmm.
very specifically about the claims you could make. So I think a lot of it's going to sort itself out, and we need it. Like I mean, by some estimates, 50 billion a year probably is the market we could get to with carbon, and that's basically helping companies achieve their interim targets as they get to net zero. And so that's money we need to spend on. We got to do a lot of reforestation, but yeah, I mean, the thing is, I think the technology is going to leapfrog over the
Right.
standard setters, and you're going to end up. A company would rather go to an Orbify, and like give me my precise like confidence of this carbon, and you're going to be able to offer them a data product that shows that, and that's all you need for the EU compliance.
One of the things that you mentioned, by the way, I'm also very happy that you brought up below ground biomass
Yeah.
earlier, right? Because soil is having a big moment, but also needs that big
Oh yeah.
moment
I mean,
in
we're
recognition.
like, I mean, we really, I mean, it's like we know more about outer space than we do about soil. I mean, like I was talking when I said that before, I was talking about just like land cover. Like we don't have a good land cover map. Like, is this a natural shrub or degraded forest? But then what's below it has everything to do with carbon.
Right.
You can have it looks like a forest from the sky, and then if the mycelium network isn't healthy, it's not the carbon gets pulled in by the mycelium and the organisms in the soil. So trees only hold a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why there was this great mystery about like where is all the carbon going?
Yeah.
Because we were spitting out more carbon than we understood. There's more carbon ending up. There should have been more carbon in the atmosphere
Yeah. Yeah.
based on how much
Absolutely.
we've been emitting, and they couldn't figure out that difference of like why, because they said here we have the trees, we know how many trees there are, why, and now it turns out it's because they didn't understand the web of life underneath the ground, and then that's storing just massive amounts of carbon in addition to providing nutrients and water flow. I mean, yeah, we were a funder of the Mother Tree Project, which is the scientist Susan Simard, and her research is just absolutely fascinating because she saw that all the she documented in a series of papers the how trees share resources underground
Mm-hmm.
using mycelium as sort of like an internet, if you will, but
Amazing.
actually an
Yeah.
internet where they move molecules,
Cool. That's
including carbon. So I mean that just is the most absolutely fascinating work that we hardly even like knew about this like 5 years ago.
that's really amazing. Yeah. That's absolutely amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So in the future we'll get more. We need to get the ground sensor data cheaper, and there's a lot of cool people working on that. And then how you mesh that together with satellite or aerial
Mm-hmm.
data is kind of like the next. That's what everyone's going to probably be doing their PhDs on the next 5 years. Is like how
Yeah.
you combine those.
And I know that like soil just like just plays such a big role right now, and it's a very good development, I think, in the scientific world. And yeah, I mean we also have a soil, I think it's a soil carbon
Mm,
layer in our
yeah,
platform, but we, from my understanding, just like everybody else, I think we're also thirsting for more data, right? Like
yeah.
the challenge is still the understanding. And what I wanted to say earlier, what you were saying, sort of moving beyond the existing the standards and methodology. So what I'm learning a lot when I do talk about future customer stories, so talking case studies of how people are using Orbify, which is one of the things that what we always say is one of our competitive advantages, that it's really easy to integrate our platform into other ones.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually what a lot of people seem to be doing now with our thing. So it's kind of goes to the point what you were saying. It's not only about these are the specific regulations and the compliance, but there are all kinds of purposes that other organizations are recognizing as an opportunity to make a difference. And then it's of course great when the different products that are being created can also be integrated with one another.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do want to know from you though, because it's just something that of course we have to deal with a lot on a daily basis. Some of the regulations now that are in place and that are coming. So EUDR was delayed by a year, essentially, in simple terms, but it's coming. Like the first article I wrote for Orbify was called "Better Late Than Never."
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then we also have now with a few carbon related regulations in the EU. So there is the most people I think are more familiar with the abbreviations actually, but I'll say what they are and I'll say the abbreviations. So the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and then there is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is CBAM. And those are the two major ones that I want to ask about. So just really quickly, what happened is that I think it was last week, there's this EU omnibus package that was announced, and that, from my understanding, it's pretty clearly going to happen. So this omnibus package, essentially for the CSRD, for the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which essentially is the goal is it requires companies to report on the impact of corporate activities on the environment and society, and requires the audit or assurance of reported information. That's sort of the official explanation. And so they postponed the requirements until 2028 for the companies instead of 2026 or 2027, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So it's also sort of like with the EUDR, there's a delay. And then with the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, with CBAM, they are exempting small importers.
Mm-hmm.
And I read some statements that so actually this is an elimination of obligations for 90% of importers in the EU that don't need to comply. But I read a statement from, I don't remember exactly, but some EU representative, I think, who explained that while this is a big chunk on both, actually, on the compliance that is removed, also the CSRD, it's also removes 80% of companies from the scope. It actually, they're saying in terms of the emissions, it will still meet 99% of the emission requires anyone, because it's really about the major companies, right? That's what essentially what they're saying. And this omnibus package, the reason why they passed, or why they're probably going to pass it, is essentially because there has been a lot of the companies and a lot of other players, I think, have essentially been saying that they're having a hard time, first of all, understanding and following the compliance. And so the purpose is sort of simplification without losing a lot of the meaning. Now, I can't say if this is meeting that goal or not. So I'm curious, what's your take on it? How much you know about it? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not following it closely because there's only so many.
Yeah.
I mean,
Sure.
I've been involved in SBTN, which is the Science-Based Targets for Nature. So that's sort of like a parallel to SBTI, trying to support companies to set nature positive targets, which are then, of course, in alignment with CSRD. And then there's the WBCS, the council, the Alliance of Major Multinationals are frantically trying to figure all this out. And I was actually I think I sent it over to you to look at. I was looking at kind of like the fact that like the Nature Positive Initiative was just formed, what, like maybe not even 2 years ago. And all of this time, they've just been landing on a common set of metrics.
Mm-hmm.
And they just put out their draft one after consultation. And we were one of the, we, many people added consultations into, even if you weren't part of one of the big NGOs that were behind it. But so even on the like the advocate side, they don't even know, they're still forming the metrics, and it's now sorting itself out. Like I think SBTN has helped also, and it's like it's getting clear, that there's sort of three big ones, which is the extent of nature, the quality of the nature, and then the species contained within that nature, and then does the corporate footprint have a harmful impact? And on the flip side, has the corporate invested positively in making this chunk of nature better? So
Right.
more nature, so that's nature positive, right? Like it's sort of a strange parallel to net zero, like where we don't have bio credits yet. I mean, they're starting, but they're a long, long way off. But they're just sort of figuring out the metrics. And like I said, like the maps aren't even giving them the first and arguably the simplest metric, which is the one I've been like really focused on lately, is land cover. Like what's the extent? And it's not land cover. I should clarify that, because it's land cover is types of land. So shrubland versus open
Mm-hmm.
forest versus evergreen pine forest, right? Like there's different types. There's a whole typology for that. But the thing is, in one ecoregion, like this big map behind me is all the ecoregions of the world. Like in one ecoregion, if you see a shrubland pixel, that's not nature, because we know this all used to be tropical forest, right? For
Right.
example. In another landscape, shrubland is natural.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's the interpretation of is it a natural habitat, like containing nature, or not? And then SBTN put out a version 1 of a map that tries to do that, and that was a very, very difficult, complex process, which didn't end up well. so
Yeah.
so they're working on version 2 now, because I think it was like 80% of all the land is natural, which is some of the problems we're talking about. Like for corporates, this is a huge deal, because imagine you're having to transparently disclose that some of your supply chain is in the area that suffered deforestation when it was just a cocoa plantation.
Right.
So
Right.
we don't even have the first part. Then the second part is around quality. So again, it gets into the frameworks, like how intact is, like, is all of the biotic phenomena still present? Like, is it just trees and just dirt underneath, or is it trees with all of the understory canopy, right? And then the third one is species, which is like abundance and rarity are the two kind of big ideas there. So like, does it have all of its species? I mean, there's many, many more, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
simplifying it. So those are the things that companies have to report on. And I will tell you, like, I have friends that are CSO, sustainability officers, many good friends. And a lot of them went on a very big learning curve to understand net zero, because they were not climate people, right? All of the CSO people, that I back in the day were recycling, and it was just little stuff. It wasn't, let's better light bulbs and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's more like energy and recycling. And then it suddenly became net zero. Imagine the learning curve of like a typical CSO. And back then also, you couldn't really get your master's in, now you can get a business degree in sustainability, but back in the day you couldn't.
Yeah,
So
it's also very recent. Yeah.
yeah, all these CSOs like were ramping up to figure, what the hell is this net zero thing, and what does that mean, and when, and it was all confusing, and everyone's getting attacked. Then they all launched their net zero, and then they got attacked by the Guardian, so then they pulled their net zero targets. And then now you've got to do your nature targets,
Mm-hmm.
which is
Mm-hmm.
like 100 times more complicated than your climate targets. Basically, the climate is just, you're measuring one thing, carbon
Yeah.
dioxide.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, 5 things, like carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, and fluorocarbons, pretty much.
Mhm.
4 things. Um, Now you've got to measure 825 ecoregions, all with different models, all with different measurements of is it natural or not natural? What's the condition? What's the abundance of species? Like, where are the threatened species? So that's a lot of the work we've been doing on is on that last one, that
Mhm.
rare, the we call it the tip of the spear, like the how do we stop extinctions from happening? So that was a big paper we put out last year. But yeah, I mean, it is a, I mean, I was like kind of honestly sort of relieved that all the companies got a lifeline, because we don't want a bunch of companies to come out and being forced with a regulation that they just simply cannot deliver.
Yeah.
Like, I
Yeah.
mean, I've talked to McKinsey, like I've talked to all these people, like no one has this.
Yeah.
No one has the big, like, here's the system,
Mhm.
you just type in and figure out, here's your AI tells you what your impact is. It's like, it is really complicated.
Yeah.
And I mean, the CSO people, the sustainability officers, like, you have to, so you went from like needing a bachelor's degree with your recycling program to then you needed a master's degree, in climate or something. And now you need a PhD. Like every major multinational has to have a PhD on staff to figure out the biodiversity stuff. And many do now
Mhm.
have PhD, and I'm talking to a lot of them, so I know that it's like it's happening. But holy crap, man! I mean, I mean, it is like net zero is a walk in the park compared to nature positive.
Yeah.
Net zero and modulating climate emissions is just one part of it. To me, it's actually should have gone the other way, where it's like, it's probably fine. We focused on CO2, which is the easiest thing actually, but that's now just one part of a lot bigger set of things. So yeah, it's going to be interesting. But I was happy. Those recommendations, joint recommendations, have come out, and that's but yeah, it's going to be a journey, man. And Europe, of course, is ahead. I mean, the U.S. isn't going to be doing anything. So maybe 2030. Yeah. So unfortunately, this idea of nature positive by 2030 is like, maybe nature positive on paper. Maybe we'll have our nature positive plans done by 2030. Maybe
Mhm.
really lucky and work really hard and have amazing AI tools, and Orbify is a publicly traded company.
We're hoping
You
so.
know, I like
We'll do our
these
parts.
big data analytics companies, like, that can provide all these services at a reasonable cost. Then maybe we'll have our plans in place by 2030, but it's going to be then changing those supply chains.
Yeah.
It's absolutely, it's such a task, man.
Yeah. Supply chain sustainability is such a huge topic now in this space, and yeah, we see exactly all those challenges. I guess the one positive element I see is that there really is a market now for sustainability officers, essentially, in the companies, right? Like
Yeah.
that really, they have realized that no matter what, this is really essential. And I guess the question to you is a little bit like, we've identified this as a big challenge. And I'm super happy in a moment to get into more on that map
Mm.
and nature positive and those things. But first, I just want to ask you, like, what do you say to the sustainability officer, right? Who sort of feels like it's overwhelming, right? Like the readers, but also do you have something that you would, like what how you can encourage them or what to focus on?
Yeah. I mean, everything is so edgy right now. Like, I mean, on the supply chain stuff, I mean, what I'm encouraged because the private sector is taking it really seriously, and I think it's also partially because climate was really political, but nature is not political.
Mm,
So, like, everyone loves nature and wants to protect it and gets that it's a crazy thing to destroy nature. But collectively, everyone's just doing their harm in their own company and maybe giving some philanthropy to save tigers somewhere in Nepal. Like, bringing all that home is a huge journey. And I mean, I don't, I haven't talked to too many. I've been mostly interfacing with people in the corporate side that are looking at beyond value chain, because that's a place where you can sink your teeth into. And beyond value chain, for people that don't know this catchphrase, BVC, it's basically investment. It's like carbon credits. It's investing in places not related to your supply chain, like tiger habitat in Nepal. Like, even if your company has nothing to do with Nepal, you can still give philanthropy and then maybe somehow take credit for that nature positive. So a lot of people are working on that piece of it. And that's just because of the work we've done recently. That's mostly what I'm doing. But on the supply chain and bioeconomy stuff, there's a lot of movement. I mean, it's a lot happening. There's actually an institute now at Chatham House on bioeconomy, that I think Hoffman Institute, and Brazil is a big leader in this. I have mixed feelings about it, honestly, because I think if the Brazil model wins, which, I think there's lots of different models of how to do this, but the kind of, I would call it, let's not call it the Brazil model, let's call it the eco-modernist model, is that everything is human influenced at this point. Let's get rid of this silly idea about nature and conservation areas, and let's just focus on how do we maintain biodiversity while using every inch of land. That's like, I'm putting that out as like the eco-modernist approach, which is like, everything is degraded. Let's just plant crops everywhere in the forests, and let's do hybrid things where we have eucalyptus plantation right next to a native forest. So this is a real bioeconomy idea. And I think, the silver lining there is that Brazil has a lot of indigenous territories, and a big part of this idea is indigenous people should continue governing their land. And they have been doing so very well for 1,000+ years with a high biodiversity outcome, even though you could argue that they are manipulating the landscape. Like, the reason why there's such an abundance in the Amazon is because indigenous peoples curated and selected certain species. And so it's the human garden, kind of Garden of Eden, where it really was a true symbiosis of people, but very small numbers of people.
Yeah.
A
Yeah.
tiny population covering a huge lot of land that manage this land really well. And all the studies show that indigenous led areas have many times a higher conservation value than a protected area that's protected by the government. So I think that's kind of like one approach. The other approach is like, it used to be called fortress conservation. I think that's pretty much been thrown out the window, which is like, we just need to like fence off all of the good stuff and
Right.
not let anyone anywhere near it. I would say One Earth, we are like in the middle. Like, we think that there's important things in the bioeconomy. There's important things in some places need to create the refuges, and some species are very shy, and they will just, if one person comes by, they will not be there. So I think that there's different approaches for different landscapes. But yeah, in terms of like, but I could say encouraging things to students, and I would say this is the best time ever to learn geospatial modeling. The people that will be getting jobs this year and next year and the year after and the year after, the big companies are going to have geospatial skills. So that's like the new Excel. Like, if you didn't know Excel back in the 2000s, now you got to know like how to do geospatial mapping. And but yeah, like, but I think the technology's advanced so much, it's a great time to learn that. I feel sort of sorry for the older CSO people, but I feel very optimistic about the young people coming in now.
Okay, well,
I
that's
don't
a
know if
nice.
that's a satisfying answer, but Yeah.
I think there's still something in there that
My
is
main
that.
advice for the CSO is, if you're not old like me, if you still got energy left in you, go back to school and get a geospatial certificate or something, and you just need it so you can do your own work.
Yeah, and I mean, our answer to that, of course, is the service providers like us and others who are in the space,
Yeah.
cooperate with us,
Yeah.
and we can help.
Yeah, no, I mean, if Orbify could start to be like an outsourced CSR geospatial, like I think that's going to be a good business.
Yeah, and I mean, I have some positive information, at least on the recent. There's a lot of negative things happening, but there is the positive thing that the COP16 nations,
Mhm.
right, actually did manage in the end to agree at the last biodiversity conference, to mobilize 200 billion, I think, per year, for by 2030 is
Mhm.
also the goal is still stated by 2030, for biodiversity conservation in developing countries.
Mhm.
So I mean, and again, when we're talking about where there's these two different models, right? Like, are you just going to fence off, or are you sort of hybrid the landscapes? I think one of the things that I wanted to mention in that part is not our tools only. This is like, it has to be to meet already some of these regulations that the EU has put forth. Is like, we also have a tab, for example, in our tool, and I'm assuming that all these similar tools have it too, is about indigenous land. So like, the moment you would basically infringe on that, you already know that you can't have a project that's going to be additional there.
Mhm.
And I think yeah, I mean, I think the struggle then is also really, what is it happening to the areas designated as indigenous lands, right? And is there are they losing or gaining indigenous areas that are classified as such? Because that's obviously what the data then tends to rely on, I think.
Mhm.
um, but yeah, I mean, that's of course a big topic.
Do you
Indigenous,
guys do you guys have your own indigenous layer?
we have a layer that we use. So for example, if you have an ARR project,
Wow.
then it will say it, like, I don't know, like, I can email this to you because I
Yeah,
don't know
dude.
the.
Man, I would love that. You're the first that I've heard that's trying to tackle it. I mean, it's getting your hands on this data has been really hard. Like, we rely on this paper from 2018 by Garnett is the lead author, which kind of built a model on, I forgot what scale it's at. It's not 1 kilometer. I think it's bigger than a kilometer resolution, but it's like sort of the probability of an indigenous land. But every single indigenous territory is not mapped, and so
Right.
and partially that's they don't want it to be mapped because they distrust maps. And then,
Hmm.
Rights and Resources Initiative has been doing, they put out this landmark report. I mean, they have the landmark app, which got a bunch of funding recently. So I don't know, maybe you can pull data
Yeah,
from that, but that is far from complete.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
we've been trying to, like, ourselves, like, God, like, that's frequently asked. And we have a huge indigenous coalition that came on the Global Deal for Nature. So we have 150 indigenous groups that were part of that. And so one of our ideas is, like, how do we get a much better open access map of indigenous lands? Yeah, so let's talk about that because if you have
Yeah.
it, um,
So like,
yeah,
yeah, where we get the data, I don't know. I need to, I have to get into the platform. So we have like an information like button, right? So if you use our, like, pretty much every tool, every layer, everything has an information button where you can see what is the source of the data.
that's cool. It's really important. I mean, one of the biggest insights we have from the global safety net, which was one of the things we kind of, I guess, we were rabble rousers at the COP
Mhm.
15 in Montreal, but that when you add it, when you when you understand that indigenous lands have as good, if not better, conservation outcomes, that leads us to believe that we should treat them as protected areas de facto.
Mhm. Mhm.
So in our model, if you look, so there was and this there was Rights and Resources did some of this. WCMC, World Conservation Monitoring, worked with them to do this. But basically, we found in the global safety net that roughly 50% of the Earth's land is in a natural state. It's actually a bit less now, but we're doing a new process to get a better estimate. But of that, 30% is indigenous by using this Garnet
Mhm.
estimate method. And then you look at the protected areas that that are protecting conservation sites. There's a little overlap of about 2 or 3% that are protected and also indigenous. So they're
Mhm.
co-managed by an indigenous group with the government. But then when you add all that up together, you're already at 33% protection, or
Mhm.
34%,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Wow.
So our whole point was, why do 30 by 30 when we're already at 34? All we have to do is allow indigenous tribes to have a standing in this
Oh,
convention, and that was called the third way. So that's kind of
mhm.
like, yeah, I probably I definitely like, yeah, it was contentious. We were very strong advocates for this third way, whereas most of the kind of normal NGO people at in the governments did not want anything to do with this, because that would have given indigenous people a much bigger standing than they currently have.
Mm.
But I will say that they did in the end make a really big statement. Some of our colleagues helped write that statement about the third way. So by third way, just so your people understand, there's sort of protected areas, which think of them as national parks or whatever. And then there's this thing called OECMs, which is other effective conservation measures. So that can be a game reserve or a land trust, private land that's got a conservation easement.
Mhm.
And a lot of people wanted to bundle indigenous into that. And they were
Right.
like, no,
Okay.
no, no, we're our own thing, because
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
we're a totally separate thing from that. And so they did make that statement. And I think I've seen continued inclusion of indigenous people in the conventions now. And so I think
That's
that's a good positive sign. And I mean, I would love that by 2030, they're all grandfathered in,
yeah.
and
I
these
understand that.
are, and I can tell you about what we want to do to make that happen, which is actually has a very interesting connection to equity markets. Well, not equity, sorry, sovereign debt in particular, working with asset managers to help
Okay,
time.
that sounds fascinating.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very fascinating theory of change that just emerged last year. But so trying to get governments an incentive to acknowledge the indigenous tribes and leave
Ah,
them
right.
alone, basically.
Yeah. Great.
So yeah, that's a big thing that we're advocating for. But that's amazing that you have that, because no one else has kind of like operationalized that, except for us in our own little way. And we don't, I'm not doing it the way I would like to be doing it. Like, I'd like to be
Mhm.
more spatially explicit about it.
Yeah, so we have again the data. I don't have the source of the data right now, but I can tell you it's a layer indigenous territories and protected areas to ensure the quality of ARR projects. Our template includes an assessment of indigenous territories and protected areas using multiple data sets actually to define these territories. A base layer is built using the native land digital map for improved accuracy. Protected areas are designed for their natural ecological and cultural significance and are safeguarded from human exploitation or development. This is what we have this is
Yeah,
from our official guide. Um, this is more like the user guide, user manual to make
yeah.
them understand what it is. So the data sets, I can tell you once I get into the platform and
It sounds
uh,
like, yeah, it's native lands, but we should talk about a collaboration, because we've got some ideas. We need an enhanced version of that.
okay, that sounds great.
And yeah, and also on protected areas, I should say, because you guys are involved in carbon. Uh, there's been several studies, but I think I saw it go through on LinkedIn a couple days ago. I think there's another paper that one of the best opportunities is reforestation inside protected areas.
Ah, right.
So you have to avoid a protected area for a red plus credit, but for an ARR credit, actually that significantly decreases the risk profile of that carbon credit,
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
it's already government recognized, and in many cases has government funding for management. But it's just that there was degradation or deforestation that had occurred historically. And that's one of the things in Global Safety Net 3 that I'm working on now, which hopefully we'll announce at the COP. We want to we'll have a metric of every protected area polygon will have a metric of how much natural land is present inside the polygon. So because every single one, like the average, some are estimating the average is 40% degraded of protected areas.
Wow.
So that, yeah. So just because a government draws a line on a map, that will. So this is all getting into the Global Safety Net Index, which is that thing I told you about for the asset managers. But the index is basically like it's like a double A rate. It's like rating bonds, double A, triple A. And we do it through 1 through 10 right now, but we might change to the bond one. I mean the AAA, AA. But yeah, so just because if you have protected areas in our index, that increases your score. But right now we don't assess how degraded that area is.
Right.
So
Fair enough.
If it's highly degraded, we'll then only give credit for a portion of that. So that's in the new index that I've had it semi written up. We're going to publish it this year.
Cool.
But yeah, that's something. And again, no one is there's been papers on this.
Right.
But no one's managing a platform that provides these statistics. So yeah, I think it's important.
I wonder, with sort of this, with this map. I guess first of all we should get into the map and talk a little bit more before I ask these questions. So I read your Medium article where I think it sort of explains it, and there's a lot of there's consideration of I think ecoregions and biomes and all kinds of different things. So maybe you can give sort of an overview what exactly the map represents, and we can take it from there essentially.
Well, yeah, I mean the map. So the thing behind me is the bioregions. So that is, and I did this TED talk called "If Nature Could Draw a Map of the World," because we started asking this question when we were back at DiCaprio Foundation. Countries are a terrible polygon to use if your goal is conservation of wildlife and biodiversity, because so the building blocks are what we call ecoregions, and there's 844. Well, if you exclude the Antarctica, no one's working in Antarctica, but there's 825 ecoregions. So these are very unique, specific types of land cover, if you will, but habitat types. So like everyone thinks of like the Amazon is like one big thing, but actually the Amazon is 20. I think it's 25 ecoregions, and we group those into 5 bioregions. So you have the southern Amazon, the western Amazon, which goes up against the Andes, the northern Amazon, central, and then coastal. The mouth of the Amazon, and those are all have different characteristics and climatological differences and species differences. So that's why I did that TED talk, is I wanted to like flesh out this idea of what's a better way to think about preserving life on Earth. Country by country by country is just a terrible way to do that.
Right.
and so then what you're doing is you're kind of looking at nature's countries. So let's see what nature needs to do. What is a target for this whole area? And then, Colombia has this part, Brazil has this part, Peru has this part. So you worry about countries second. So it's kind of like the opposite of political economy, which is, all of the fancy London people, you probably know, I mean, the Germans too. They love bioeconomy and political economy and all this stuff, which is like, well, we have to work within the political constraints. And I'm just like, bullshit. Bullshit. Look at just what happened in the US
Yeah.
overnight. Like, we
Yeah.
do not have to think through. Like, this is a fantasy that the United States and the EU are going to hold together in the way they have been. It's an
Mm.
absolute fantasy. And the political economy idea came about. Sorry, this is a tangent, but it's one of my ventings. Uh, the political economy people came about concurrent with this sort of unipolar world order
Yeah.
when the Iron Curtain fell, and suddenly it's this Brussels and Washington D.C. run everything, and we all are kumbaya now, and everyone's great, and let's immigrate everybody everywhere, and the neoliberal fantasy, right? Like, and now we're seeing all of that crumbling before our eyes. So anyone who gives me a lecture about political economy, I'm going to send them to my TED talk, because I think it's like it's entirely more likely that, let's say 30 years from now, I don't know, let's see, how controversial do I want to be? 30 years from now, the lines on the map are going to be different than what they are now. I believe more and more we're going to be looking at geophysical boundaries to economies. So it's not going to be bioeconomy, it's going to be ecoeconomy. And in order to understand ecoeconomies, you're really thinking more bioregionally. What are the constraints of growth? Of course, we're going to have trade, but we know we're not going to continue trade the way we've been doing it. With Trump's tariffs, they're shutting everything down. And now it's like this is just a domino effect. We don't know. A year from now, that we would be having probably a totally different conversation. We just have no idea the political realities on the ground. But we do know that the geophysical realities are not going to change much. Climate change is going to change, push things. Things are going to get hotter, things are going to get wetter, things are going to get colder, whatever. But basically, we have our geophysical structures, which are essentially climate and topography and plants and the species, all the insects and animals that live in those habitats. Like, those realities are going to be the realities that we're going to start to reorganize our society around. So that's the big idea with bioregions and the map behind me. Now, the global safety net is a software tool kind of put on top of that, so that we're able to interface with the UN conventions, and we have, like, based on the data, recommended targets for every country to make in terms. So target 3 is the 30 by 30, which is often very confused to mean that every country does 30. That's not at all.
Right.
And I wrote a whole huge paper on this. You can Google. It's called 30 by 30 is not a one size fits all target. And boy, did I get crap for that one. But I was just stating the obvious. Like, a third of the countries are highly degraded and don't have anything close to. They have 10%, right? We're not asking them to get to 30 and throw villagers out of their land. Like, that's the implication. Like, so that's one of the reasons that the harsh critics of 30 by 30 and a lot of the criticism we've received, which we always have to try and explain. Please read our paper, because we very clearly say we don't want human displacement. And in fact, we think communities can be partners and benefit in sustainable livelihoods from conservation. But we don't want to displace people. So there's like roughly a third of the countries that aren't going to get anywhere near to 30. There's a third of the countries which we call mega diverse or highly biodiverse countries, which have, like, Costa Rica, Colombia, Indonesia. Like, they have so much biodiversity that their target needs to be way higher than 30 by 30. And then you have kind of a lot of Western democracies are sort of in the middle. They're medium developed, where they have around 30.
Yeah.
So the problem is those people are running the conventions in Geneva and Brussels,
Yeah.
US,
Yeah.
So we have a very skewed, we're always trying to say we're anti-colonial, but actually we have Western liberal elite people in Western liberal democracies, like, imposing their reality on the rest of the world, which is wrong. Like, some countries need way higher targets and some countries need way lower targets. So Anyway, so that's what the global safety net does. It tries to basically say, okay, like what's here in this bioregion? Okay, your country is this part of it. Like, well, your targets should have representation from these areas. So that's what the global safety net app does. And I'm pretty sure if you just Google it, we had a branding person say we should change the name because most people hear global safety net and they think it comes up at the top for me, but they think it sounds like the
Also for me.
social safety net, which I think it actually is. But
Mm.
yeah, it's called. I don't think we're planning on changing the name. It's the global safety. Yeah, if you Google global safety net app, you'll find it.
But
Um,
even without app, it's for me, it's also number one.
oh, good. That's good to know. Yeah, so I'll tell the branding person they're wrong. But yeah, it's a highly visited site. We have people from every single country on that site every day, and a lot. We don't know because we don't collect data because we don't want to put impediments. And I've gotten shit for that too. Like I should be collecting data for our funders, but we're pretty sure we have a lot of government ministers looking at the data and NGOs looking at the data and regular people, just wanting to see what's in their backyard. But we're working on a sort of an AI version. We're version 3.
Mm-hmm.
We put out a big paper last year that used version 2. Which was attempting to get to a higher resolution. So version 1 had a 1 kilometer resolution, quite crude. For version 2, we wanted to go to 100 meter. And so we were trying out with European Space Agency data how to do this. And we kind of tripped in. I mean, that paper, it was good for the paper we put out, which is called Conservation Imperatives. That's looking at like what we consider the most important 1% of land left, the 1% of land harboring rare and threatened species.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the thing. It should be the top of everyone's targets. So that was that paper. For that, it worked okay. But when we tried to scale it to the rest of the world, it just didn't work. Now we're on to version 3, which I suspect we're going to have to go down to 30 meter to actually do it.
Mm-hmm.
And we might. So I've spent the past 2 months. If you guys want to help, let me know. I've spent the past 2. I've looked at like all these land cover models. I've talked to all the modelers and trying to figure out how we get a better map for our statistics,
Right.
which then could benefit everyone else. So that's my big project now, is just getting that map better
Yeah,
to have. So
that's super interesting. I think that's super interesting. I'm just looking, I was just browsing through that ranking as you were speaking. Yeah, funny. European Union 27 is exactly 30%.
yeah, not
Yeah.
just exactly like we didn't fuss with the numbers. That's exactly
It's funny.
the EU. When you add up in some, like Romania has more than Germany, and the UK has very little. But when you add all of the EU together, it adds up exactly at 30% of yeah. Is that
We're
weird?
good. We're good at creating the goals that we can meet.
Mm-hmm.
Very good
Very
at
ambitious goal. You already have it. Yeah.
yeah. We're really good. Romania, yeah, I was there last year. It was beautiful, and that is a very wild country. So I'm not surprised there. That there's more than 30% probably. Yeah, it's really fascinating. I'm looking. This is really interesting. To see
Yeah, and
this.
that index where I did that so quickly. It was for our work for the Montreal. We were working with a bunch of NGOs. Well, particularly Avaz was a big NGO partner, and we put it out also so that I could have some just simple benchmark. And then it took off like wildfire, and I just made it and I forgot about it, and I thought, oh, that at some point I'd love to do a better version of it. And then we got a phone call one day from this really major asset manager that is involved in the sovereign bond business. A lot of people, every time I say this, they think, oh, you mean green bonds? Green bonds are very small percent of total bonds. Every year, just emerging markets, we're not supposed to say global south anymore, developing nations, we're not supposed to say that anymore, but like emerging markets, nations borrow 4 trillion a year. And the average interest rate on that is 5.5%. So what this asset manager is just a visionary, amazing group out of Europe that buys these bonds from emerging economies, but they have a preferential lending rate or a preferential buying program for countries that score high on our index and other biodiversity related index. Well, no one else is doing it other unfortunately no
Yeah.
one else is doing an index but us, so they're using ours, but they use other data. And so they are spending billions of dollars using global safety net data. So I wanted to create something a lot better, higher fidelity, so higher resolution, higher cadence. That means we need the historic trajectory like you were talking about, and also like we're going to create a formula that corrects the weighting for those countries that are severely degraded. If a country only has 10% of their land left and they protect all 10%, in the old version they would have gotten the top score because it was
Mhm. Mhm.
they protect 100% of their natural land, right? That was
Yeah.
the initial index. And that's crazy. They like, a
Yeah.
country that has a huge amount of natural land and protects it all should get a much higher score. So that's one thing we're going to fix. We're also going to rank the layers of the global safety net differently. So areas for the magenta, you see the bright pink areas. So those are the areas that are the high by the rare and threatened species area, and those should rank much higher.
Hmm.
So the more of that you protect, the high, you'll get extra weighting on your score for that. So those are a couple of things we're going to fix, and then we'd love to add in other stuff like restoration and things like that. But first we got to just deal with the basics.
It's that's a super interesting thing because the rare species, right? On the one hand, just statistically speaking, I assume that a lot of the mega diverse countries that also happen to be quite big, a lot of them, right? Because we're talking about the politics, like China and the US, I think are both on that list as well. And uh, so in that case, you'll have a lot of rare species, of course, statistically speaking, in a lot of those countries. But then it really gives this, in my imagination, a lot of island states and
Yeah.
things like that that will also probably play a significant role in that.
Yeah, well, it's actually so if you look at, there's the magenta, there's the medium green and light green. Those, to really oversimplify it, because I'm not a conservation biologist, but we worked with a lot to develop this. It's about dispersion. So when you have very rare species, generally speaking, that's because they're highly endemic, which
Yeah.
means they live in niches, little niches in specialized ecosystems like the Arc Mountains in Tanzania. The little tops of each of those mountains are like little tiny islands
Hmm.
and the species from one mountaintop to the next, which you could see from one to another, have
They're different.
completely different species because they've been isolated for so long, over thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So that you have all of these incredibly unique insects and birds and amphibians and primates that are nowhere else on Earth, right? So that's tends to be highly endemic, so very range limited.
Yeah, yeah.
In
I
the middle, you have what is kind of mostly called mega diverse. People use that word unprecisely, but
Okay.
high biodiversity countries can be countries that have tons of biodiversity that aren't necessarily highly rare and threatened. And we still want to protect all that stuff, you know.
Mhm.
And then the lighter green is actually highly dispersed species. So that comes from a paper called Large Mammal Assemblages, and it often involves like land that might not be considered high biodiversity but is used like for migrations of
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
bison or whatever, or migrations of gazelles, like seasonally. There's assemblages of animals that come together and are highly dispersed, and often they're migrating from one place to another. So those are the kind of three big categories of the biodiversity. And then, of course, we have the protected areas, which are just protected areas and could be any of those. And then you'll see we have a couple, the turquoise and the light blue colors. Those are areas that are also very important for ecosystems, but aren't necessarily identified with specific species regimes. So, that's where you get like representation of an ecosystem or a remote area that we should protect just because it's super intact. And then also areas that are storing carbon or providing water, because you need forested hillsides to get water into the aquifers, for example. So all of that's important land, but it's not necessarily specific biodiversity function. So that's how they came up with the 5 different types.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I'm just looking a little bit at the map as you're explaining it. And I'm also like, I was just curious, what do you do when different classifications match, right? So because the first thing when you talked about, like when I hear large mammal landscapes and migration, I think of the Masai Mara and of the Serengeti, for example. And I was looking, but of course that's also a terrestrial protected area, and of course it's also a high biodiversity area. I was super interesting with it.
It is. It's also some of it's interesting when you do these processes because sometimes things appear you wouldn't expect necessarily. And it's built on other people's research. So it's a synthetic map. I mean, we're taking from lots of other models, sort of. So in some ways, it's a multi-model. Like it's there you go. And
I just wanted to put it on so that people can sort of
if you
see.
zoom, actually, if you go back to where you were and just like zoom into that area in the lower area in the DRC, like see that kind of right by Burundi. If you keep going, do you see how there's like a light pink and a dark pink? So you can turn on and off the layers, but the dark pink, this is just to show, this is the paper we put out last year, that the light pink was version 1. And this is based on key biodiversity areas and zero extinction sites, and all these different scientists have contributed to making these magenta areas. But what we did is we did a fractional cover analysis in the paper that came out last year, and we found that, like you can see there, almost all of that area is now converted. So if you could turn off, you can scroll down and turn off the turn that 2020 off. Or you can. And actually, that's now that whole upper area, we would consider that converted to human use. So this is an example of why you have to do this data, because like if you were going about trying to do protected area in that other part, that's already too populated according to our methods. It's too overpopulated to work as a conservation area. However, that remaining area still works. So that's what we did in the version that came out last year. And the one I'm working on now, we want to go even finer resolution. But if you turn the pink back on, you'll see, like, check out see how much there used to have.
Is this I think this somewhere here, I'm not sure if I got it exactly right, but somewhere here is where the Virunga mountains, I think, are, where the gorillas are, I think.
Well, there should be, I think Virunga is a formal protected area. Do we have that layer on?
That's right. That's also.
Turn on that layer there. That one.
Here we go. Yeah. And then you can see, like,
there's an overlap there. But like we would argue that it's an extremely important priority to get the last of those magenta areas right next to Virunga. And also, like, you look at Machungu, like that huge magenta area off to the left there, which is connected to a protected area. That would rank very high for us, because it's almost no land conversion between 2020 and 2024. You can see the light is, the little light ones are where the communities are starting to come in. But right, like here, we could protect a huge part of that area, and it's already connected to this big protected area.
Hmm.
So that means more species can move between the areas. So that's why this map is important, because it shows you the relative differences. Like, we would rather the DRC protect that magenta area than the lighter green area
Right.
right next to it. Um,
Yeah.
of course, we'd rather than protect both, but
Both. Yeah. 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 Goes without saying.
yeah,
Yeah. 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 Amazing. Yeah, and it's interesting. I was looking at your because I used to live in Kenya, and I went into the neighboring countries and was always kind of interested because I thought that in some ways the impression, this is just by being there, not by actually looking at any facts. The impression is that they all did such a good job with how many protected areas
yeah.
they had. It's amazing to see. I saw it in your ranking, sort of like Tanzania's percentage. I think was like 40.
Yeah, if
Some,
you mouse over, yeah, you can see 40% target, but they score very high. Cause see how there's a score of 9, because
yeah.
almost all of their natural land is protected land.
Hmm. Right. And in Kenya,
And yeah,
it's the sort of yeah.
And that's why we're gonna change the scoring system, right? Because, like, look at how little Kenya is protecting compared to
Hmm.
Tanzania. Their
Hmm.
score shouldn't. I mean, their score is a little lower, but it should be. There's really
Right.
not much natural land left in Kenya.
And it looks like there are a lot of unprotected rarity sites in
But
Kenya
there,
as
yes,
well.
that's true. Yeah,
Species.
yeah. There's some really Kenya is an area I'm like really interested in, because I think
Yeah.
the government is motivated, and
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, Kenya is this like two-pronged story from my experience, right? Like I was working in a different sector. It was actually in the health
Mm,
sector, and there is the great thing about that country, in my experience, is that it's a super innovation thirsty country, and it really also allows for innovation.
yeah.
But of course, it's also a very in some ways it's a very successful country, but that also means a lot of human development, and
Yeah.
I think on the
No,
environment of
I mean, I think Kenya, and Kenya also has, like, in certain politics now too, but um, you have UNEP headquartered there,
Mhm.
Kenya, and you have all these young entrepreneurs and technology. Like, Kenya's becoming this interesting place for technology, um,
Mhm.
and these amazing. I've met so many cool entrepreneurs from Kenya, and so to me, like, I keep waiting for, like, one of these countries to announce that it wants to be like the green Silicon Valley.
Mhm. Mhm.
Like, someone's going to own that at some point. Like,
Yeah.
and it's nature tech,
Yeah.
right? Like, that's the new. You already know, like, you're a nature tech company, like, and we didn't even talk about it, but we have this whole investor project where we scrape all this data in how investors and funders are funding in private capital, so not public markets,
Mhm.
but in private markets. And the nature tech category is growing,
Yeah.
um, and it's still very young, but, like, the future of technology is monitoring, measuring, understanding. Like, it's like, who's going to come out with the EKG machine for nature.
Mhm. Mhm.
Like, it's like with whatever sensors and satellite images and software and AI
Mhm.
modeling, and, like, Kenya could and should own. Like, that would be such a
Yeah.
great thing if young entrepreneurs
Yeah.
took on nature tech in Kenya. If I were a wealthy person, I would probably be funding an
Yeah.
accelerator or something. But I mean,
Well, we can work on the communication side maybe to to propose this because I think this is super interesting thought. I think and like I also know like Rwanda it's a small country but it's a country that I think is also really trying to grow some kind of new innovation economy. And yeah, I don't know. I found this. I always thought this part of the world is so interesting, and there's so much happening, and
yeah,
yeah, and there is really an embrace of technology. Um,
yeah. And if
yeah.
we can make the case that, the whole big meta question we have, and all of us are involved in it, you guys too, is, and I kind of get at this in the end of my TED talk, is like, how do you incorporate nature into capital markets? Like,
Hmm.
how do you incorporate nature into the global financial system? And these are all entirely solvable
Hmm.
problems. And if they were solved, like, there should be an abundance of capital to make Kenya the new Silicon Valley.
Mhm. Yeah.
Like there's so much money. I mean, and like I do various thought experiments. So like 4x is the one I do in my TED talk. 4x is all the global currency it trades. Closer to 7 trillion is traded a day. If you just did a 1 basis point
Yeah. Yeah.
on the currency trades, you'd have a $200 billion annual capital accumulation, which then would benefit all economies,
Yeah.
because that
Yeah.
money could then flow into conservation, things like conservation basic income, where essentially you're providing communities that live next to conservation areas income based on the success and performance of those conservation
Mhm.
areas. So if Orbify is like um, uh, tracking one of these protected areas and it's improving over time, theoretically in this model that community's
This
income
is
would improve as a result of that. Like that's where we need to get to, because the global economy is dependent upon nature. It's just that we haven't Bretton Woods,
we haven't
when we
factored
formed
it.
the post-war economy, no one was thinking about that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is again where we come to a communication challenge. I mean, it's also an opportunity. But I remember a long time ago, I was working as a assistant to the executive to a climate lobbying company from Coronado, from San Diego, and I was only there like a few times a week. But one of the things that really sparked my interest back then, and this is like 2011 or something like that, 2012, was I was sort of put on a study that was put out by I think it was a Harvard study, and I found this so powerful, especially back then. That we try to really use it a lot in our communication after, also when we were talking to politicians and lobby them. The price of nature is not just a price of nature and economy directly, it's also, for example, a health price, right?
mm,
So they had these numbers in that study, like if you would attribute a value, an economy value of $1 million to a human life, then the damage from different things, right? Like how much of an economic damage does that
yeah,
actually do? And like, so they put it like on the emissions of coal power plants and
yeah,
so on, right? For just people living in the proximity,
right,
or in the vicinity of those and things like that. I thought, I mean, this was like, they couldn't cover everything, of
yeah,
course.
yeah,
It was a fascinating step at that time that I thought like was such a powerful thing. And I think when you put these things in these kind of terms,
mm-hmm.
that's why I love this, right? Like this is actually also an economic question,
Yeah, totally.
and I love your take, right? Like you sort of took away my question about what I was going to ask you about the political landscape right now, and I think you already went sort of further, saying, how is this gonna, we're not gonna think anymore in sort of the country, the borders and the definitions that we're doing right now, but we're really gonna think in these in these regions that are defined by nature and geography, essentially.
Well, I mean, I that might be post collapse. I don't want to be a doomsdayer. I think what's happening now is an intensification of nationalism,
Yeah.
which I would say all of this is a natural response to over liberalization of trade, and this unipolar idea, which Putin sort of ended when he annexed a huge chunk of Ukraine. And I think it's now we're just going to see, I think we're going to see 10 years of enhanced nationalism. Um, I think American, like you guys are staring at us like we're crazy, and we're staring at you like you're crazy. And I think everyone is like, when you see what's going on in the major cities, and this just not thinking through resources, and how to properly manage the flow of humans as they escape. Like in Syria's case,
Mhm.
you could say that was a climate induced disaster, but
Right.
it was really it's always more than one thing. It was also a
Yeah,
political
yeah.
uprising, responding to oppression, by facade. So like, yeah, I feel like it's going to be maybe 10 years of very increased nationalism. And I don't know. I mean, the thing about like bioregionalism, which I like, is that it's sort of like you can keep planning ahead depending upon whoever's going to be in power, you know, because
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
and there's this, and it's really become a buzzword. It's so weird when I started this, I thought I made up the word. And I was like, bioregion, that's a great word. Like, and I
Mhm.
Googled it and I didn't really find anything. I found like a couple weird little things. And then it turns out, you know, there was this old hippie bioregionalism thing. I wrote a series of articles about this because we look at bioregions, of course, in our map from a conservation first approach, because
Mhm.
we believe nature, like humans aren't properly understanding the role of biodiversity in their lives. The bioregional people are very focused on like watersheds. Like that's where it started sort of in the 70s. If you will, it was kind of like glorified watershed planning,
Mhm.
because water obviously is central to most local economies. But you know, the case we're making is that, well, the term is large enough to, as I made in, so I did this huge lit review going back to the 70s of like, where did this term come from? Who used it? How did they use it? But there's sort of this the fork of like the hard science group that is, we're sort of more in that group, and then there's the kind of hippies, the hippie
Mhm.
bioregional people who are doing like really cool stuff. But I often say it's like a mountain, you know, like if you have two mountains, the bioregional people are really interested in the valley because that's where the water is. Like, so
Mhm.
they're going to look at the watershed this way. Whereas if you're interested in gazelles, you're going to look at the mountain because they're occupying this mountain, you know? So it's kind of, it's like you have to look at both. I mean,
Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
think that this thinking is becoming trendy now. And like, I've been to some investor conferences where like people are saying bioregions like as if it's just this common word. It's like this new trendy word now. So
Yeah. That's yeah.
maybe we had something to do with that. I don't know, but it's definitely man. The traffic we're getting on our website is just insane for our bio. Like, and on our website, you can navigate the Earth and look at different bioregions and the species that are there. That is so popular on our website, and
Mhm.
our Google search is really high for bioregions. So yeah, I think that's going to be a trend. But yeah, we'll see how these two things interact.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, I think that the message, I think, will, even in a time like this, I do think that the message that nature doesn't actually, like national boundaries don't, or national boundaries, and therefore also like this international decision making alone doesn't really apply to the way that nature is organized. I think that sort of resonates probably with people on lots of sides of whichever political spectrum, right? Like
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
I think that is probably the case. And yeah, and I don't know, like it reminds me, I know it's a completely different concept of what it talks about, but you're probably familiar with the foodscapes
hmm,
concept in agriculture, right? Where it's essentially trying to find the different agricultural regions, so to say, or environmental region, and how, like, what grows where
yeah,
sustainably, essentially.
yeah,
And I think in this too, again, there is this this line of thinking powered by technology, or supported by technology.
yeah,
I do get the impression, again, that we're sort of full circle, where there's sort of a spring of this happening, and I'm super curious how that
yeah.
continues.
I mean, it's such a cool, exciting area. And, you know, in One Earth, we have three pillars of
Mhm.
action, and each one has its own model: the energy transition, nature, and agriculture. Because you can't do
Mhm.
One Earth in some way is like a baby, it's like a prototype of an NGO of the future that is, instead of siloing down to like one very specific niche, which has been the past of NGOs in general, you're really trying to look systemically at things. And you can't solve the nature thing without looking at
Yeah.
agriculture. And there's fortunately like so much exciting research and mapping and stuff like that happening. We have a paper we funded that should be coming out this summer or fall, which is a new global cropland model,
Oh, cool.
which uh, the previous version was used for a lot of modeling efforts around food security. So this is a much higher fidelity model. So we're still in the game on ag, but like one of the solutions we have it in our solutions framework. So we have this, like I mentioned, we have this solutions framework for investors that has 78 solutions pathways. Those are divided in those three categories. So under ag, I think there's like 29 solutions pathways. One of them is crop optimization, which has many components and different technologies under it. But yeah, like there was a great paper out recently where they were modeling different placements of crops in Africa, and like if you move millet, farther north and wheat farther south, and you can move things around, and you start to get the plant into its closer to its sweet spot, you actually get these increased yields. So that's something where AI and modeling can, again, it's by regional, right? Like it
Yeah.
could be that you can't just chop it up by countries, because you sort of have to convince this group of countries that's now growing wheat that you should actually grow teff,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
if you do that, you're going to get 30% more calories and 20% more nutrition and blah blah blah. And then we'll
And
move the wheat. Yeah, and then
yeah.
we'll move the wheat over here next to a desalination plant, and you can get X more that way, and that land is less valuable, if you will. Like, so it's kind of based on in this new model. It has 30 major crops in it, staple crops, and that's the modeling of the future, like for ag. Because once you do that, like, so all of this started for me when I was thinking about, well, if we have 10 billion people on the planet, how are we going to feed everyone? We're already struggling to protect nature, and then we add a bunch of people, and that means more cropland, right? No, it doesn't. We just are really stupid about the way we're growing crops. We decided to hand over crops to big chemical corporations in the Green Revolution. And it was American and European chemical companies were like, here, you guys figure out how to feed everybody. And so we had all these like chemistry nerds and all these like people that are totally disconnected from how ecosystems work and how people work, and forcing chemicals down to make all those aggressive things to happen. And you have these mass suicides in India from poisoning, and all the land is ruined, and strip mining the topsoil and chemically fertilizing it and spraying all these biocides, and all of these things have solutions.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
we're just like everyone who says like we are doing a terrible job. What Bill Gates, whatever he says, we are doing a terrible job growing food for people. We can do it so much better if we think bioregionally, and especially if you combine bioregions with new technologies. You can get this like triple, quadruple win where we're growing specifically within the modeled conditions of this bioregion, because we know X bioregion is going to be 3 degrees warmer in 20 years or whatever. You can model that now, and you can really plan ahead, like what is the right thing to focus on, and then you're going to have inter-bioregional trade, where you get different commodities that way. But that's the future. And there's a great book like that probably set me on my path, which was called written by economists, called Small is Beautiful, by
Yeah. I think.
Schumacher. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's such a great book. It's really short and it's very idealistic, but everybody should read it, because it's like he was seeing early on that the future is small is more powerful and more beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And lots of people working together is much better than 3 corporations. This idea that 3 corporations are going to be more efficient than a million people working in collectives is totally debunked, in my opinion, when you look at India. Like, we saw what happened to India when you had 3 corporations running everything. It literally sent the whole country, one of the richest, most beautiful, most fertile countries in the world, into absolute dire poverty. And Modi, whatever you think about him politically, he was like, enough, kicked out
Right.
all the chemical companies. He's like, we're going back to the basics. And so there's some really interesting projects like in Andhra Pradesh. There's this giant collective of farmers that are using more biodynamic approaches. having bigger yields, more people are employed, so they're not committing suicide because the men don't have jobs, which is what was happening before. Um, and much more resilient to droughts, which are, as climate warms, we get more shocks.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a flooding shock or a fire shock or a heat shock. When you plan more bioregionally, you can mitigate for those shocks more easily, and adapt to them. So that's a whole climate resilience adaptation frame. That's not, when you talk to the climate smart ag people, that's just the chemical companies repackaging themselves.
Yeah.
They're they are the problem. Like, I just say it point blank. Like, there's one or two things we can learn from them, but for the most part, they're just terrible. Like, everything. Like, I just read this paper this morning on silica, that they spray all these biocides now because we're getting more like blights and mold and blight and things like that are affecting crops. And so they're just increasing the chemicals, increasing the chemicals, increasing the chemicals. It's just such an example of the future we're going to have to create with, like, combining technology and bioregions and nature-based thinking. Like, that's the future. It's not these chemical companies.
Yeah.
That's why we need more
Yeah.
science. Back to science philanthropy. We need more funders to fund the actual science.
Yeah. Well, when you started with this response, it's funny, I went in a similar direction in my head. And I was thinking, since we've been talking about the role of technology, one of my hopes in that is actually that this, geospatial technology and AI can actually have an empowering effect on smallholders. And yeah, let's see, right? It could go many ways.
Yeah.
But it is my hope. I know there are projects like that are really trying to give more of a voice, because yeah, by knowing how to do it more sustainably and more effective, the smallholders will hopefully be able to make the
Yeah.
best decisions for themselves.
Yeah, and what's everyone going to be doing when AI is doing all
Yeah,
these white collar jobs? Like, I'm seeing this trend here. So many tech people I know are going into farming.
yeah.
Uh,
I absolutely, and people really, this is, I mean, another hope of mine, right? Like this, the one thing that it could really spark is sort of a like hands-on and also creative sort of renaissance,
yeah,
of the kind of crafts that people get into, and the kind of work that people get into. There's definitely a big movement, I think, in these regenerative farming jobs and
yeah,
things like that. And I know people who I actually know somebody who I'm not going to put any personal names in here, but like I know somebody who, after sort of had an accident and after that was in a coma briefly, and then decided to completely change what he was
mm,
doing before, and that's what he's doing.
yeah.
He's doing agroforestry essentially.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's the place to be. It's hard,
Yeah.
it's complicated, and that's actually a good thing because it means we need people on the ground working every day on this stuff. And how are we going to grow grapevines in southern
Mhm.
Italy in 10 years? Like, we need a lot of farmers and people who really know the land. And maybe we need to supplement with some new mineral that will get the vines what they need. Like, it's like it's such an opportunity for employment and uplifting smallholders. Like, it's probably, there's a great agroecology fund is one of my favorite nonprofits, and they do a lot of grant making into farmer collectives. And if people are interested, look up, their projects are all just amazing. Like, and for every one amazing project they fund, there's like 20 that they don't have money for. So instead of the USAID, forcing developing countries to spray Monsanto chemicals everywhere, which is what was happening until very recently. I mean, well, now USAID is getting shut down entirely. So the donors, the philanthropists, the donors, the investors, and the donor nations all need to get their, like, act together. And um The problem is that it's how do you get KPIs out of like a farmer collective in Andhra Pradesh, pretty hard. So you kind of have to, it's a different type of donor arrangement, and governments are still reticent to fund this. But yeah, anyway, yeah, but it's, to me, that's the future. I mean, I think it's farming and conservation are going to hopefully employ 5 billion people.
I hope so.
That's about what we need, I would say.
But in the interim, I get a little bit from, some of the articles I read from you, and also the some of the things you touched upon today. I do get the impression that there is a sense of optimism in you about also the way that big corporations are going, right?
Nature positive is such a big idea, and it's got a lot of ways to go to flesh it out and get the wrapping all the data around it and everything. But like, there's absolutely a sense, especially among corporates and investors, and everyone wants to invest in this, and they don't quite know how yet. But like, I think that, so that's what makes me optimistic, because I know that the trend is going in that direction. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, and I was wondering, which sort of sectors, I guess, do you, as of now, where we're standing now, where do you see the most hope?
Yeah, I'd say trepidatiously. Well, I mean, energy is just, like I said, I think it's just economics at this point,
Mhm.
except for the kind of last. So we're putting out a climate model this year called Razor's Edge, which maps out a global transition to net zero by 2050, but actually almost zero by 2055. Although probably that should be 2060, because I think that last 2%, 3% is going to be really hard. But other than that, I think it's just economics are going to take over. Nature is in the right direction, like rhetorically speaking, and I think people are more interested than ever. And that one is really solid and moving. I mean, the fact that we have like these big TNFD and CSRD and all these things coming now, which is amazing, right? Like, when you have the people in the suits arguing about biodiversity and butterflies, that's a good thing. So that one, but that's a little earlier. It's like kind of really policy right now. It hasn't matriculated out into the action on the ground. And then ag is the farthest behind, but there's definitely the most in impact investing. Everyone wants to invest in this, in food security and water security. And I think, like, some people are going to make a lot of money on this. I think, or maybe not a lot, but a medium amount of money investing in how to do this new kind of agriculture. Yeah, the business models are tricky, but I think so for all three. Those are the three indicators I see, like positive indicators. But yeah, definitely ag's got the biggest challenge. But yeah,
Okay.
we'll get there, right?
Okay. Yeah. Is there anything that you feel like, I don't know, that now that we've been having the conversation for a while, is there anything that you feel like we missed, that's like a big thing that we should be addressing in this conversation still?
I mean, probably you and I could probably keep talking for a while, but I'd say, yeah, I mean, the main call to action is like, we need more philanthropy and early stage investing in this nature, tech, science space. Like I'm spending time. I'm trying to convince funders, to spend more on this. And so yeah, any funders out there, investors, please invest more. I think, like, there's some campaigns though launched to, like, every investor should have 2% in nature, and I'm like, it should be like 50% in nature. Or how about 30? Like, let's do 30, since we have the 30 by 30 target. Every investor should have 30% of their portfolio in one of these categories. It's just, there's so much money sitting around, and it's like, that's my frustration. Any opportunity to get it out there, that funders, if they're ever listening, that tell their friends, like, this is the time to put money in startups and organizations like ours that are working on the science that then the startups can use, right? Like, science, a lot of startups are creating their own science, but like, I feel like that's a huge bang for the buck, which is
Mhm.
underinvested. So I guess I'll end with that.
Okay, all right. Yeah, no, but that's a good message, I think. And I think that sort of cuts to what we were talking about in the beginning too. The other thing is, do you uh like what are sort of I mean I asked this now about which sectors, but like what are the things that you would say give you the most hope looking forward?
Well, I think definitely. I mean, we have this cool thing on our website if people want to go there. It's called we used to call it the marketplace, but they changed the name of it. If you go to our website and click explore, and you go to the bioregions, we have a tab that has projects. So we're indexing like about 150 or so projects that are just like every single one of those projects is just it will give you so much inspiration because it's like a lot of most of that was built for a portfolio for philanthropy. So it's a lot of people working on conservation and regenerative agriculture, agroforestry, forest restoration, largely local communities and indigenous people. Those projects are just all of those give me hope. Like, and any money we can get to them, like the amount of money they need to have an impact is so small relative to giving your money to WWF. Sorry, like the big NGOs, it's your just money is going into a giant black hole. Whereas you can give money to these people specifically, these groups, and those just have such a big impact. And like I think hopefully people will copy it, right? Like,
Mhm.
but yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's so many examples in there, but there's like one I've been talking to these guys about in Kenya, going back to Kenya. It's such a cool project because it's a coastal area. It combines mangrove restoration and sustainable fisheries around mangroves.
Mhm.
Um, an agroforestry project using moringa, which I don't know if people know about moringa, but it's this incredible super plant that is native to the region, which has more protein than soy. I think it's like one of the highest protein plants on earth. It has all these minerals. It's got these huge tap roots, and so it's able to bring minerals up. And then the third part of it is they have a kaya, which is a sacred forest project, which is an intact forest, and they're going to create a buffer to it. So it's like that's just like
Ah,
one project in Kenya of this community that
cool.
touches all three of those things, which
Mhm.
is like, and that's Green World campaign is the one that runs that. Green World Africa, I think. Um,
Mhm.
it's just like those are the kind of projects you're just like, oh my god, this is just so cool. And it's like sort of the sacred part of intact forests, but in new agroforestry plus mangroves all together. It's really cool. So it's like kind of bringing the cultural heritage together with
Yeah.
restoration. And they're going to be sucking a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere, so that's good for the climate. They probably won't be able to access the carbon market, but
Well, yeah, I mean, we'll see. I mean, the hope, this is kind of where I always hoping like because we have these technological jumps in a lot of countries, right, that are adopting technology in a way much faster than I don't know, like European societies were or something, because the rapid change is just accelerating. That also means you have like generations of people who currently who are like the same level of technological skill and familiarity, but their lives started at a very different point. So like a lot more actually in connection with nature, literally on the ground, right? So I remember a lot of my colleagues at this health startup I was working in Kenya. They used to, when they were little, or when they even in their early adult years, they would be working on a farm, and now they're in an office and working with like AI.
mm-hmm.
And I think that there is also this opportunity there that um the connection with nature is still more real
Mm-hmm.
culturally there, right? But they also have access to these technological tools. So that's kind of one of the things that I'm hoping
Yeah.
from all of this rapid change, right? Like often the rapid change is seen as a challenge, but it can really also be an empowering tool, because they're yeah, they're not losing any time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one example of a cool tech that I think could drive economies in this space now is, one of the biggest value points, not really currently monetized, is the validation work, which, I mean, you guys know, as you're doing, you're doing science, from satellites, and but I believe you probably also have, everyone's got a validation program, right? So, people should be, think if like we had 1 billion people doing small points of validation, and they could get compensated for that.
Hmm.
And so you could create a whole new kind of economy. Like, think of it, if like iNaturalist. So there's actually a company doing this called Mosaic, which is, two French, I think they're both French guys that just graduated. They just finished their degrees at London LES or somewhere. I should reach out to them, but they have an app where, you get micropayments for for ground observation.
Cool.
So imagine, like, that's like almost like a piece of like fintech meets monitoring technology, that then a company like yours can triangulate up into a satellite, and we can have that better, richer data. And then suddenly you're starting to like unlock more economic value through something that's quite a small intervention. So I kind of feel like that disruptions, I don't know who, it feels like it's still very, very new right now. It's like we've been doing micropayments for a while, but like
Hmm.
linking it together, like I think that would be, man, like, if someone was starting to do that at scale. These Mosaic guys they've done quite, both did their PhDs using this software, and it's like a smartphone app to do this monitoring. And like, there's probably all these cool companies starting to do things like that, where that's just a
Hmm.
huge unlock. Because if suddenly, like, I'm able, as just a philanthropist, like, in a or sorry, in an NGO who has philanthropy money, and I can suddenly like distribute these payments and get this rich data that I actually need for my land cover model. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
that's different than carbon markets. Like, so much paper trails in the way of a carbon credit, but that's like a direct disruption. And suddenly you have all these people working from home in the field, measuring trees and soil carbon, or just taking photos, doing this verification work. Like, I mean, that's like a big unlock too, which is a little more lower tech than I think you're talking, but I think it's an example of one that's should be like ready to go right now.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think it goes on a lot of different levels. So I thought this more as a general thought, really.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just think, yeah, there's a lot of opportunity there. This is a beautiful example. Um, yeah, I wanted to ask you finally, like, what is, like in the end, like I said in the beginning, we're really happy to have you on, and I also want to encourage everybody who sees it to check out your posts on Medium and on LinkedIn, and of course the studies that you and One Earth have been involved with, which is a lot, and of course to check out One Earth. Um, and your TED Talk. Uh, but that also means I want to know of all those things, right? Like related to One Earth or also otherwise. What are you proudest of to this date?
How proud of this? A nice question. Wow. I think probably the biggest labor of love has been, the map behind me. And we are, I guess I'm sort of unofficially announcing it here, but we are going to do a book called Bioregions of the World, and it's kind of like a new atlas, thinking through, instead of by country, by these bioregional countries. Because I just feel like it's, we've had these stories coming back, like, we just did it for ourselves. Like, we wanted our own framework, and then we published it so people could use it if they want to. A lot of people have asked to download it and use it. But like, someone was telling me that, this the school teachers have been using it. And our earth is really cool. If you go on the site, it's very colorful, and it looks like kind of like a cool like toy, so the kids love it. So like, this one teacher was saying, like her kids just want to play with it like all day long. and like learn about the animals and like what are the, you know, I mean, some of it's all very technical, but actually the fact that like kids are engaging
Yeah,
with it and like just love it and they instantly get it, you know, like this is where I live. I live in the great, the tall grassland prairie. You know, I'm part of that
that's cool.
country.
Yeah,
You know, I'm part of the whatever, you know, tropical forest country. And so I think it's like that idea of belonging to your country and nature is something I want to work on more. And that's kind of come out of this labor of love with the bioregions. Like I would love to have like where, you know, you can become a citizen of your country, something like that we want to do where you can kind of
cool.
join and like learn more.
Awesome.
Because a lot of it starts with learning and then you start to find out, well, what nonprofits are in my bioregion that I can volunteer for. And so hopefully we can kind of build that
That's
out.
brilliant.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing that makes me the happiest when I think about it. All the other, I am very proud of our papers, but yeah, I should say the 30 by 30 paper, but actually like that, you know, I kind of like
Mhm.
that. It's not quite as exciting or fun as the bioregion stuff. So yeah, that I don't know how long we've never done a book, so like we're kind of just starting on the journey. But yeah, we're gonna do a call for photography for it, so people
Cool.
can submit photographs of their
Awesome.
bioregion. So yeah, well, if yeah, any ideas on that? If you ever want to partner on anything, like let me know.
I love it. I think it's super interesting. I mean, I already think regardless, like you and I, you know, it's probably not the last time we'll be having a
No, yeah, for
conversation.
sure. Oh, it's so great. Thanks for reaching out. And where are you based, by the way?
So currently I'm based in Sweden. I'm in Malmö, so
Oh,
just
you're in
across
Malmo.
the bridge from Copenhagen. Yeah.
Oh,
So we are in a country with a lot of space.
yeah.
Um, yeah, and a lot of forest, one way or another, but there are a lot of trees,
Yeah.
and a lot of water. So we are for us. The beneficial thing is we can spend a lot of time in water on land and in nature on land,
Yeah,
and
yeah. Right.
it's quite beautiful. Yeah,
Cool. Well, hopefully I'll see you in person soon. Yeah, this was great. It was fun. Always fun talking to you.